My name's Stuart Gill. I'm the Master of Queen's College. I think most of you know that already, but we may have some visitors with us this evening. This is the third week in a row that we've actually run a Sugden Institute event. We had a climate change hypothetical. Last week we had Professor Peter Holbrook, who's with us this evening as our Sugden Fellow, speak on Shakespeare and nature. And tonight we welcome Professor Patrick Porter, who I'll introduce in a few minutes. As we come together this evening, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present. And we have a number of young Indigenous students within the college who I see as future leaders, not only in their own community, but indeed in Australia and perhaps in other parts of the world. I first met Patrick 20-odd years ago, I think, as an undergraduate student at the University of Melbourne when he was my senior resident tutor in another place that I won't mention, but not too far away from here. I'd also known Patrick's mother and father for some time. In fact, I think this sounds very Scottish because my father used to say, "Aye, but I ken our father" in Scottish language. But I did actually know your father, I think, from about 1985 when we served on a committee together. So I feel that I've known you, Patrick, for a long time, but he's gone on to a stellar career from his time in Melbourne when he was doing law, and also I think you were interested in the classics at that stage and studying Roman history. But you went off to Oxford, I think to look at chaplaincy, was it, at one stage in the First World War, but you've since moved on to great issues of politics and strategy, and worked in a number of universities, including King's, and now find yourself as the Professor of International Security and Strategy at the University of Birmingham. He has published a number of books, and I think everyone will have received a copy of Patrick's biography. He has served on a number of important committees and given advice to the UK government, including, I believe, the Ministry of Defence. And it's terrific that we can actually welcome him to Queen's College this evening to speak on an interesting topic, a war in search of reasons, Operation Iraqi Freedom, 20 years on. I was reminded as I thought of Iraq, of the first Gulf War, and I was actually, I can remember where I was, I can't remember the second one as well as the first one, because I was actually in a catfish restaurant in Jackson, Mississippi, when the first Gulf War was declared. And I remember the restaurant emptied within seconds as everyone went off to watch CNN, and step by step what happened during the war. And I was teaching in a college, and each time we had a break, the American students that were in class, they were all American students apart from a couple of Africans we had in the class, all wanted to go out to see what the score was. It was like watching a football match. You may reflect a little bit on that this evening as you talk about particularly the US and the involvement in the Iraqi war. I'm really looking forward to what you're going to share with us, particularly about the evidence and the ideological approach to the war in Iraq, freedom 20 years on. Please welcome Professor Patrick Porter.
Well, thank you, Professor Gill, very much. Very gracious welcome. Thank you, folks, for being here. My great thanks as well to Queen's, not least because I was a Norman boy. It's a chance to relive my misspent youth back on College Crescent. Also a tutor at Trinity, so no one trusts me. I want to ask really two simple questions which I think have quite elusive answers. And the first question, which is raised because it's now the 20th anniversary of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and I suppose this room is divided quite neatly between those who find that an interesting fact and those who feel old when they're told that it's 20 years ago. The first question is, why did the US lead a coalition to invade Iraq? And the second is a broader question, which is what I call, how do we explain...
Could you speak up a little bit?
Oh, my apologies. Can you hear me now? The second issue, the Syracuse temptation. Why is it that the strongest states, why are they prone to risky peripheral adventures, military campaigns? What drives this thing? For those who only remember this dimly, after a confrontation over Iraq's weapons program, the United States led a coalition to invade Iraq in March 2003, swiftly overthrew the regime in Baghdad, and then struggled ever since in a deteriorating, fractured country with civil disorder, communal violence, civil war, mass displacement, and even for those who regard it still as a legitimate and justified operation, it was also a disappointing one. And I think this matters. I think it matters for us. This was a consequential war, not just because of the unexpectedly high price in blood and treasure, but also because it led to other things that still worry us. The rise of the Islamic State, the empowerment of Iran in the Gulf, the encouragement inadvertently of North Korea to develop a nuclear weapons program, Moscow's increasing alarm about regime change, and it led, I think, in part to Donald Trump, because part of Donald Trump's constituency in the United States is aggrieved veteran communities who form a small but important slice of the vote in those swing states that won in 2016. So there's a very real sense in which the war then shapes our world now. What I'm about to do is not to issue a kind of preachy critique of the war, because there's plenty of that around, and goodness knows I've been involved in that. So this is not primarily lamentation. I'm going to press pause on lamentation and press play on explanation. One of the problems with Iraq is that everyone's got an opinion on whether it was a good idea, but they're less good at explaining why they did it. And in fact, if they disapprove of it, they find the most unspeakable possible motives. One of the problems here, folks, as you will agree, is not the lack of reason, but the abundance of reasons for war. If I went around this room, I reckon I'd get 20 different versions of why this happened. It was the weapons of mass destruction, it was the oil, it was the Israel lobby, it was George W. Bush's daddy issues and his Oedipal complex, etc. And there is an abiding mystery here. There is an abiding analytical mystery that even people who were very close to the action still confess that they don't quite understand why Washington made this move. Richard Haas, who was head of the policy planning in the State Department, says he will go to his grave not knowing why the United States did this. George Tenet, then the head of the CIA, confesses it's still a bit of a puzzle. And the explanations that are in front of us range across the spectrum, from the most elaborate, for example, Fuad Ajami saying that it was about creating a new foothold in the Middle East that was separate from the Saudi bloc to give the US its own sort of position in the Gulf, all the way to the most visceral. As one National Security Council official reflected, we just wanted someone's ass to kick. So that's the menu before us. So let's go through some of the standard explanations, because I think each of the standard explanations captures something of this, but it also leaves something missing. There is something missing in each of them. Each of them doesn't quite work, and I don't think they quite work as a compound either. So the oil argument struggles because if you actually read the documents that we have from the US administration where they're talking to each other about this war, they only very rarely and very fleetingly mention it when they think no one else is listening. And there is some desire for the benefit of Iraq's oil coming back on the international market after sanctions, but it's hardly core. And we have a further problem, which is that under US occupation and under a US client regime, it's not American firms that win the lion's share of the Iraq oil contracts, it's Russian and French and Chinese firms. This is hardly a behaviour in line with ruthless petro-imperialism. Then there's the weapons of mass destruction. So there's one line of argument that says this was what it said on the tin. This was about disarmament. This was about the fear of rogue states arming themselves with the most apocalyptic weapons, chemical, biological, nuclear, and the fear that they would transfer those weapons on, perhaps, to terrorist networks after 9/11. This was the 1% doctrine that Dick Cheney made famous, the idea that if there was even a remote chance that a rogue state with weapons of mass destruction could pose a threat, a 1% chance, you had to treat it as certain. And there was an idea that we can't live with this after 9/11, that old classical doctrines of security like deterrence or containment are obsolete. But that then raises further puzzles. Well, okay, but why Iraq? There were perhaps as many as half a dozen countries in the world, some of which were already designated rogue states, that had a WMD program, in some cases more advanced WMD program, and a working relationship with terrorist groups. One of those was a US client ally, Pakistan. One of those was North Korea. And recall that in October 2002, as the US was in an escalating confrontation with Iraq, North Korea came to the United States and divulged that they in fact had an active uranium enrichment program. And America's response to this was to simply park it in multilateral six-party talks, apply sanctions and call it tailored containment. And this was a much more advanced nuclear program than Iraq could be suspected of having at the time. Wouldn't it be the case that a US that was terrified simply of weapons of mass destruction and rogue states, wouldn't it have just considered going after North Korea at that point? If this was a country that was gripped by the fear of the 1% danger, wouldn't it, and if it was a country that was willing to shoot on suspicion, wouldn't it have been much less relaxed about this problem? And of course, there is a strange incuriosity in Washington between 9/11, 2001 and 2003 about the actual state of Iraq's weapons program. There is a demand for intelligence that will support a case for war, but there's much less interest, in fact, almost willful disinterest in any kind of more detached clinical assessment. Recall that the rollout of the campaign in Washington to sell the Iraq war happened before the CIA published its national intelligence estimate of Iran's weapons program, an estimate that the White House admitted George W. Bush didn't even read. And in fact, we know how many congressional representatives read that document. It was very few of them because it was the fully non-released version was held in a secret location in Washington. Only 6 of hundreds even bothered to read it. So a country that was simply frightened of WMD, you'd probably find more curiosity and more alarm about the problem more generally. That doesn't mean there wasn't a fear. There was a fear. But I'm drawn to something that Donald Rumsfeld said, the Secretary of Defense at the time, when the US was reacting to 9/11, was contemplating striking Afghanistan. Rumsfeld said, yes, but Afghanistan hasn't got good enough targets. Iraq presents targets. So this is not just about threat and fear, this is about power. It's about wanting a target that you can hit. That doesn't mean they thought WMD were fictitious. They didn't. They were frightened about Saddam using these things in the event of a war. And so it's not as though they secretly disbelieved in it, but they weren't curious to test the assumption that in fact there was a WMD program. Rather, policy drove the intelligence process. Then there's another argument, which is that this is about either Israel or the Israel lobby. So the idea that the US invaded Iraq primarily to do a favour to its main ally in the region as a beneficiary, or that the Israel lobby, the domestic lobby in the United States, both Gentile and Jewish, wanted to get rid of the most anti-Semitic and rejectionist state in the region. This suffers empirically. We do know that in fact the members of the Israel lobby, at the kind of head of the organisational groups, were, if anything, reluctant to be too associated with this. If anything, they were much more worried about Iran. In fact, the historical record suggests that the Israel lobby in 2001, 2002, 2003 was much more of a sympathetic bystander than an active participant. So that doesn't really get us across the bridge. And then, of course, there's another argument which moves away from reasons towards groups, which is that whatever it was Dick Cheney's war, or the neocons' war, or sinister kind of groups in and around the GOP. And one version of this argument is that, look, this was a war for blood and iron to gain some kind of material benefit, dressed up in the grand language of democracy promotion and liberalism and liberation, and that any talk of democracy was just George W. Bush, who was largely a sideshow figure. This was really about Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz doing their realpolitik thing. But this argument is also simplistic, because we do know that, in fact, President George W. Bush was both central and indeed willful as an actor. In 2002, there was the discovery in Kermal in northern Iraq of an Islamist training camp where it was feared chemical weapons were being produced. And Dick Cheney and some of the hawks aggressively lobbied the president to take it out, whereas Bush overrode them, as he did overrode Cheney on many issues, from talking about a Palestinian state to going for a United Nations mandate. In other words, Bush was stubbornly independent. And if Bush was stubbornly independent and exercised great discretion, then what George W. Bush thought really does matter. And George W. Bush, amongst his many stated reasons, had a genuinely transformational view about the war, what the war was about, which was, it wasn't just about disarmament, it wasn't just about a projecting of power, it was about changing the regime, changing the regional order, and transforming it with a kind of messianic streak. The notion that Iraq was just a cabal of people who foisted the war on everyone else, you can see the attraction of that because it gets everyone else off the hook. But in fact, you had a much more wide consensus in the Democratic Party. Some of the most influential backers were some of their most senior security grandees, Richard Holbrooke, Kenneth Pollack, who wrote the most influential book, The Threatening Storm, Dennis Ross. In fact, the pressure that was felt in the State Department and the Ministry of Defence is reported to have come just as much from external media outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, not just Fox News, and not just coming from any particular individual within government. So this was in fact a much more collective movement towards war. So thinking about the inadequacy of each of these stock standard explanations, instead of just coming up with another reason, maybe we should be worrying about this whole notion of reasons, this very powerful embedded assumption that the state has a war aim, it selects its aim, it chooses its target, it makes up some nonsense pretext and moves in for the kill. Now, it's very likely that that kind of war can and does happen, but I don't think it fits in this case. What we have here is not primarily reasons or even a decision. What we have is an impulse for war. An impulse for war which is causally prior to reasons and rationalisation. In fact, my argument here is that, if anything, the US, as a very powerful state in 2001, wanted to do something big. It wanted to strike boldly. It wanted to assert itself in the international system. It was very confident it could do so. And then only after crossing that Rubicon, its leading decision makers started scrambling around for rationales. That is the best explanation for why, in fact, there are so many shifting reasons for the instability of the rationalisation. Paul Wolfowitz, US Deputy Secretary of Defence, made a famous comment in an interview. He said, well, we talked about WMD because it was the one thing everyone in the government could agree on. So that's the kind of the bureaucratic politics argument, that there were lots of different factions that wanted to take Iraq out for different reasons. But that in itself is also misleading, because that assumes that each of those factions knew its own mind and had a consistent, solid, constant reason. But in fact, Wolfowitz himself, like others, kept changing and altering the emphasis of their argument. One of the problems here is when you jump into this debate, the temptation is to see the world as the superpowers saw it and take that as the obvious starting point. But maybe we should pan back and look at the assumptions that are being made here. This is a country that has just been attacked by a certain terrorist group that is now occupying a large and historically difficult to occupy country in Central Asia, Afghanistan. It's undertaking a great global counter-terrorist campaign. It's facing other crises like the economic blowback from 9/11, like a flare-up in the India-Pakistan rivalry. And yet it is very quickly, almost intuitively, deciding whether to attack another large country in the greater Middle East. And there's something here about the horizons of a superpower. That is, this is not particularly about America. This is about a country that has an extraordinary and lopsided power relationship with the rest of the world. It's not often that you have a country that is so relatively materially strong as the United States at the turn of this century. And as an old-fashioned dinosaur realist, I think that is the most important level of analysis here, that the US had multiple fears and dreams in 2001. It was frightened of WMD and terrorism. It wanted at times to transform the region, and it also wanted to make an example of Saddam Hussein to impress the world. And it wanted the Israel-Palestine dispute to be somehow corrected by it. And it wanted a reduction in oil price, right? And it wanted to show the great powers of the world that it wasn't to be messed with. You can keep adding these things, but these are the fears and dreams of a very powerful state. It's America's power that defines and makes possible these fears and dreams. Robert Kagan, great neoconservative intellectual, once said that it's the capability level that defines what fears you can afford to have, right? So he said, if a man only has a knife and knows there is a bear in the woods, then he might choose to try and coexist with that bear. If the man has a gun, then he might decide that he's more frightened and therefore can do something about it. So there is a symbiosis between capabilities and anxieties. Consider the scope of some of the first responses to 9/11 in the US in the Bush administration. Donald Rumsfeld, in his first meeting that afternoon, having helped carry the dead out of the Pentagon, says to his advisor, and we have the record, go massive. Judge whether intelligence enough to take out Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden not enough, things related and not. Go massive. Presidential directive from the White House the day after 9/11, drafted and then approved in October, declares a war not just on Al-Qaeda but on all terrorism. This isn't just public show, this was a private document to order and prioritise government action. November 2001, under the auspices of Paul Wolfowitz, there is a group of hawkish intellectuals who gather at the American Enterprise Institute and create a document, a blueprint that influences the government called the Delta of Terrorism, which is a very ambitious kind of secret manifesto saying that the problem of 9/11 begins in the Middle East, not in Afghanistan. And it diagnoses a malady, a sickness in the Middle East, which is the kind of the cocktail of Islamist extremism, terrorism, authoritarianism that has to be uprooted and changed. It needs surgical correction. And that the main, in fact, heart of the problem for them is Egypt and Saudi Arabia. But those two countries are too difficult and too complicated as targets, whereas Iraq is weaker. It is both the most menacing and the weaker target, which presents the opportunity to change the region. And this document then reportedly is very influential with Bush and Cheney. So notice something here, that these are, in a sense, supersized fears, almost luxury fears. In other times in its history, say 1977, 1983, 1989, if the US had been hit by Al-Qaeda, I strongly suspect the response wouldn't have been as expansive. That is, no question, there would have been a lethal reaction to the group that did this. But the idea that this then has to become a war against an ism, terrorism, not just a terrorist group, and that it has to go on to Iraq to reorder a region is a function of a big difference, and that is between 1991, the end of the Cold War, and the collapse of its only near-peer adversary, to 2001, the United States enjoys and is cursed by a precipitate rise. Its economic clout and size, its growing military power, its sense of confidence, and the sense that because it is powerful, therefore it is wise, as Madeleine Albright said, we see further because we're the United States. It's that transforms the country's consciousness. What's interesting here as well is that there isn't known to be a particular meeting or set of meetings internally where the United States and the bureaucracy decided for war. Everyone who was around it, the speechwriters, the participants, says there wasn't really a moment of decision. It just kind of seemed to happen. There was a time when we weren't necessarily going to war in Iraq, and then there was a time we were, but we don't know where exactly that was. Well, we do know now, at least from the US Army's own report, that George W. Bush said to the representatives of the Joint Chiefs in the Oval Office in late December 2001 that I've decided to go after Saddam Hussein, quite early. But what's interesting here is the fluidity of this process, that there is lots of organisation, there is lots of structure when it comes to the how and the when questions. How to invade, when to invade, under what auspices to invade, from what direction, under what coalition, at what time of the year, etc. But there's very little deliberative organisation. I would want to suggest that only very powerful states think they can afford to behave like this. Consider the contrast with Vietnam. The United States, in its decision whether or not to escalate in 1965 in Vietnam, one of the most momentous decisions of its history under Lyndon Johnson, was much more scared, much less self-confident. There was much more internal deliberation about whether to do this thing. Furious memorandums back and forth, heated debates. And in fact, if you read the history of that time, those who were involved in debating and deciding for escalation in Vietnam in 1965 were actually quite pessimistic about their chances. They didn't believe they could ultimately succeed in Vietnam, but they did believe it mattered for their position in the world. There was a McNaughton memorandum which laid down the priorities, 70%, or I think 75%, to prove to the world that America was a reliable ally and security guarantor by holding the line in Vietnam, 20% or so to deny Vietnam to China, and 10%, proving I can't add up, to help Vietnam. There was, roughly speaking, an explicit, deliberated and constant war aim. That's very different and almost the opposite to what happens here. And what happens very quickly is that having intuitively moved across the Rubicon towards an in-principle decision for war, I would say by late 2001, early 2002, very quickly what takes over is the selling of the war, the persuasion campaign, which almost runs ahead of the decision. So one answer to the problem of multiple shifting rationales is that they've gone beyond that towards trying to persuade Americans to do this thing and the world. There are three, broadly, logics to the argument of the United States and the Bush administration for invading Iraq. They are the preclusive, the coercive, and the transformational. Preclusive, go after a specific threat and destroy it, Saddam Hussein's regime. The coercive, go after the regime in order to impress the world, to project resolve and strength to the global audience, to show that America is not to be messed with. And the transformational, intervene in order to transform the region. These three storylines move in and out and bleed into each other, and there are contradictions. There are contradictions here. The argument at some points is that Saddam Hussein's weapons program is a mortal threat and cannot be survived, cannot be lived with, and must be taken out. Right? You've seen the problem with that, comparing that to North Korea. But then there's the further argument that these are rogue states, and rogue states are aggressive, irrational, reckless, undeterrable things. But then the argument is we need to remove Saddam Hussein in order to prove to the global audience that we won't tolerate rogue states, even though the rogue states are supposed to be irrational. So how are they going to take the message and be deterred if you've just said they're undeterrable? These things are there's a lot of tensions in this argument. There's further tensions. Is the point of the war to stabilise or to change the Middle East? And there's a movement between those things. On the one hand, they say we want to encourage democracy promotion, rational reform, economic liberation. On the other hand, Dick Cheney makes a tour of the region to reassure the regimes, the Saudi bloc, Egypt, etc., that America has their back. And if anything, the removal of Saddam Hussein will calm things down and stabilise the region. So wanting to calm the region down and wanting to stir up radical revolutionary sentiment. Maybe that's not a contradiction, but it's a tension. And the point is there's very little real internal discussion about whether that's coherent or wise. In the summer of 2002, this problem of why we're doing this starts to boil over in public. There is what we might call a battle of the narratives, where different members of the administration start trying to kind of clarify why they're doing it. And there's lots of complaints from the Congress and from the press that it is, quote, disjointed and contradictory. Douglas Feith, a very important player, one of the Deputy Secretary of Defense to Paul Wolfowitz, writes two memos in August and September internally that actually don't quite fit with each other. On the one hand, Saddam Hussein is dangerous because he's going to transfer weapons to shadowy terrorist groups. On the other hand, he's going to keep those weapons and use them to blackmail other states in the region, as he's going to become the new Saladin, which is ironic because Saladin was a Kurd, or Nasser. So he's dangerous because he's going to give them away, or he's dangerous because he's going to keep them. In the first memorandum, he talks about the way in which this is going to set ablaze a democratic impulse in the region. He drops that in the second memorandum and talks about how America's allies in the region are good at keeping the street quiet. This is not going to ruffle feathers. In the second memorandum, he introduces or reintroduces the question of the Arab-Israeli dispute. He's looking for something that's going to stick. And this reflects some of the other pattern. George W. Bush, speaking to his counselor, Karen Hughes, who rings up and says, why is Dick Cheney on TV talking about Saddam Hussein's links to 9/11 and Al-Qaeda? And Bush gets frustrated and says, in fact, there are lots of reasons we have to take out Saddam Hussein. Lots of reasons, folks. Not just the links to terrorists. Then Karen Hughes, who's rather confused at this point, goes and has dinner with Condoleezza Rice, who says, well, Saddam Hussein is particularly threatening, but also we have to do this in order to restore deterrence in the world. And if we don't now remove Saddam Hussein, we're going to get problems everywhere. So, in a sense, the question really is, was there anything this war was not about? The process itself, as I've said, is quite revealing. But there is one moment, there is one little isolated moment where there is some internal deliberation. Unfortunately, it happens in September 2002, which is well past the decision point. while the decision is now being sold to the country on Meet the Press, etc., while Bush is starting to confront Saddam Hussein's regime through the United Nations in his speeches, while the US is already ramping up its military presence in the Gulf, there is actually a meeting at one of the lunches organised by Stephen Hadley, Deputy National Security Council Director, where Bob Walpole, one of the officials, starts asking some rather impertinent questions. He said, well, if it's WMD, why aren't we going after North Korea? And then Doug Feith says impatiently, no, because Saddam Hussein has a relationship with terrorists. Walpole says, okay, well, in that case, why aren't we going after Iran? And this raises this uncomfortable thing that Iran and North Korea are too hard to attack, which suggests the flip side here, which is they're going after Iraq partly because it's an easy target. Not just an easy target, or perceived easy target, but one that is known, familiar, and resented, in which there are war plans available, right? An expression of power. So bringing this together, the US is struck on 9/11, but it doesn't react to 9/11 with a clean slate. 9/11 did not speak for itself. It required interpretation. Is this a war? Is it a war against who and why? And the reaction to 9/11 is a number of things. First of all, we've been attacked primarily because we are excellent. Right? The attack happened because it's an attack on democratic civilization as embodied by the United States. The attack happened because we haven't shown ourselves to be strong enough in the world. And the only correct response to the attack is systemic. We've got to uproot terrorism and evil itself. In fact, that's the metaphor that some of Rumsfeld's aides use on a long flight back from Berlin after 9/11, that this is like the British campaign against slavery. We've got to go after the terrorism indiscriminately. What then happens to reinforce this is the Afghanistan campaign, which, let's remember, by November, December 2001 looks really successful. The Taliban routed, a massive return movement for refugees into Afghanistan, the Bonn Constitutional Convention, etc., the creation of a new state. And this then gives rise to a renewed military optimism that this is possible. If you can win in the graveyard of empires, the place that is forbidding and futile for the great European and Western powers in the past, if you can win there, then you can win in Iraq. Much more middle class, with Baghdad, which is a strong seat of government, with an exile movement that is encouraging you the whole time. That victory can be rapid and overwhelming, and military strategic victory will lead naturally into democratic liberation. Paul Wolfowitz once said, this is not about nation building. This is about removing the obstacle to democracy. Removing the obstacle, and a kind of pro-American democracy will thrive, grow naturally. And this assumption here that when you remove a dictator, the forces of democracy and moderation will trump the forces of sectarianism and factionalism, and ignoring the great problem of regime change, that it creates winners and losers and can raise insecurity levels very highly. We then, of course, see the expressions of this confidence. The George W. Bush's choreographed landing from a Viking plane on an aircraft carrier to declare the end of major combat operations. I know he didn't put up the banner saying mission accomplished. He didn't take it down either. And there was a sense of triumphant finality. David Frum, his former speechwriter, writes that victory will be, quote, very, very fast. And there are all sorts of excited explanations about how America's military revolution is so fundamental that it is changing the nature of war itself. So the precipitate growth in American power created a predisposition towards what I call expansive belligerence. That is, the only way to react to such a strategic shock is to project power fundamentally and boldly into the world to effect systemic change somehow. There was an absence of deep thinking about the tensions and the contradictions in the argument. To track this change, just consider a couple of hawks. Eliot Cohen, hawkish historian, intellectual, counselor to the Bush administration, 1991 writes an article saying Gulf War I was a prudent war. a limited war that we should value. We removed a dictator and an invader from Kuwait. We showed the consequences of flouting America's will. We stopped the war to make it decisive, and these are gains that we should appreciate. 2001, 10 years later, Wall Street Journal, Iraq can't resist us. Dick Cheney, 1991, if we'd gone in, we'd be stirring up a hornet's nest, we'd be walking into a nightmare, a quagmire, an insurgency, whatever. Dick Cheney, 2001, when he's in a meeting and someone says, how are we going to establish legitimacy? He says, our legitimacy will come on an Abrams tank. It's not that these people got worse or lost their virtue, they got powerful. And power, and I'm saying this about everyone in every state, alters consciousness. And this also happened to the Democrats. After all, the leading Democratic candidates for president fell in line to approve the authorization to use military force. It was Democratic grandees and intellectuals who wrote some of the most influential accounts. I don't know whether they would have led America into Iraq in the White House, but had they been in the White House, the question of Iraq and what to do with America's colossal power would have dogged them every day of the presidency. So this matters. It matters because it could happen again, but it also matters not just about the West, but about what happens to big powers when they get powerful. China. What power does to countries when they rise precipitously. What tends to happen, unfortunately, is that countries that do have rapid success in the international system, they find it hard to restrain themselves, because if you succeed rapidly, you think you're special, you think you're appointed by heaven or history, and your bias is towards believing that power projection works, because it's worked for you so far. But let's say both of those 2 points are wrong. Let's say it doesn't happen again. Let's say China manages to restrain itself. I think it matters, and conscious of where I'm speaking, I think it matters because we have a duty to the dead. I don't quite know why I think we have a duty to the dead. I've been reading some philosophy about this, a bit above my pay grade in international relations. But we do think we should commemorate the dead. We do think we have bonds of gratitude and loyalty to the dead. I think that also has an intellectual side, that part of our commemoration and honouring of the dead is to sit here when we could be down at the pub worrying about why they died. And it's on that rather bleak note that I'll be quiet. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Cheers.
Patrick, we will open up to questions, but perhaps I can kick off. And just wondering about the whole manifest destiny thing that you see throughout US history and the projection of power and its link. You kept using religious allergies here, speaking about Lamentations to begin with, and you ended with some religion as well. I mean, how does that play into the factor in the US, thinking particularly of the South, the Baptists, the whole, Second Coming, Jerusalem, all of these things?
Great question. So I'd say 2 things. First of all, as someone once said, the devil can use scripture, that religious traditions are very copious things. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. So I'd say 2 things. This is about religion and the religious rhetoric. Religious traditions are copious things, and they contain multiple and sometimes conflicting ideas. And there are ideas in the Christian faith that support bold power projection, the sense of a special burden, the sense of mission, but there's also ideas about humility and divine judgment and restraint. And what I would predict, what I would expect, is that the larger a power becomes, the more successful it becomes, one particular strain will win out over the others. In other words, the bits you choose to quote from and believe suit the level of physical capability. The second point is that I'd say that every great power can find in its tradition an intellectual and spiritual resource to project power if it wants to. Think of 3 unipolar powers, that is, powers that are so far ahead of the others that they have a decisive margin of strength and can expect that to continue. Ancient Persia, Ming China, United States after the Cold War. Culturally different, geographically distant in time and space as much as you could require, and see the fundamental similarity in the temptation.
Zara.
Zara Kimpton from the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I'm interested that you have talked only about America. You live in Britain. The British contribution, we won't talk about Australia because it's obviously small, but it's Tony Blair was obviously very important in supporting Bush. He was from a different, he was from the left, Bush was from the right. Were the British reasons for engagement the same as the Americans when they hadn't had a 9/11? But how important was the British support for America?
Oh, that's a great question. So, Tony Blair becomes almost an American figure, a transatlantic figure in 2001. And he appeals to a certain set of images about what 9/11 means, what must be done, and the systemic root of the problem. That, in other words, this is a moment of opportunity to confront and defeat these forces of evil, including the likes of Saddam Hussein. But Britain has one big difference, and that is that part of its decision-making and part of its calculus is that it must influence the United States. That Britain's role historically is to exert a constraining influence, because Britain's first reaction, Tony Blair's inner council, first reaction to 9/11, oh my God, what are the Americans going to start doing? Are they going to start flinging around nukes? They're unpredictable. We have to get British influence in there to restrain them. Now, there is a certain condescension in that idea. It has a certain Greece to Rome sort of post-imperial idea that Britain is there to educate the unruly giant in how to run the world, but quite a powerful idea. And there's also a fear on the more progressive side that Britain has to be there, otherwise America might just quit the international system, leave the United Nations, leave the G8 and just do whatever unilaterally. So there's this idea, there's this calculation that by being in it, Britain can then shape America's fundamental decisions. Now, there was some degree to which that worked, but a lot of times where that didn't. In fact, even when America decided to invade, they made the announcement publicly before even telling Britain they'd started doing it. The United States made a number of decisions about, for example, dismantling the Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi Federal Army against British advice. So the whole notion of Anglo-American influence was actually brutally tested in Iraq. Why was it important? I think it mattered. It was, for the Bush administration, British support was desirable, but as a nice to have, not a must have. They would have been willing, I think, to do it alone. They preferred having British support, above all diplomatically, the idea that this could be internationalised as a cause. But George Bush, on the phone to Tony Blair, the night before the vote, the decisive vote in the British Parliament and the Commons, says, you know, Britain doesn't have to come in. You can come in a second wave of peacekeeping. If this is going to bring your government down, you don't have to do it. And Tony Blair says, it's worse than you even think. I really believe in doing this.
Thanks. John.
Thank you for that very persuasive analysis. But in it, you didn't mention the United Nations at all. You had just answered your question, but it seems to many people, I think, that America destroyed by acting in a way that was contrary to the rules that had been set, largely under American influence through the United Nations, and they're made to look very inconsistent now when they get stuck into Russia for invading Ukraine in very similar circumstances which completely abandon the constraints of the UN. And it's arguable that America has not recovered its sense of moral leadership that it had before the invasion of Iraq, still.
So the American case at the time and the British hawkish case was that, in fact, they were trying to rouse the United Nations to do its duty actively with regard to a rogue state that had violated international law. Part of the tragedy here is a clash of two different internationalisms. The internationalism on the one side, as you've said quite rightly, was that this is about the international rule of law, the integrity of international institutions and our moral authority. But on the other side, it was about the compulsion on that body to act, and that if the likes of France or China were against unilateralism, then they could make unilateralism not be a problem by voting for the war. I am sceptical about the idea that America's moral authority hangs and falls by the United Nations. After all, there have been many violations by every permanent 5 member beforehand. That doesn't mean you just ignore the United Nations. I just think ideas like moral authority don't rest neatly on that. And in fact, recall that in 2004, after the United Nations had now authorised a military presence under America's leadership in Iraq, Iraqi insurgents blew up the United Nations building in Baghdad.
Alistair and Alan, then I think we'll go to enjoy drinks and canapes, and we can have some further discussion. Alistair, then Alan.
Thank you very much. You talked about disbanding the Bath Party. One of the criticisms has been that there was insufficient planning or insufficient resource put to the post-combat phase. If there'd been a different outcome after that, do you see things could have turned out differently for American statute?
Great question. So there's an orthodox answer and then there's my answer. The orthodox answer is that the US and its allies would have been much wiser to have less institutional impact on Iraq's existing structures, not to have a wholesale purge of the Ba'ath Party and the army, not to have a situation where people are being thrown out of their jobs and with access to munitions, not to unleash anarchy in this kind of disastrous project. Part of the problem here is Iraqi politics, though, and this is my sort of answer, that if you look at the crucial meeting where Paul Bremer, who was the American proconsul, head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, sat down with the heads of Iraq's kind of major political parties, there was a demand for de-Ba'athification and wholesale de-Ba'athification from the Shia and Kurdish parties. In other words, you've got this terrible choice. Either you do de-Ba'athify the state in order to legitimise the new order to the majority of the Iraqi citizens, because they're frightened you're going to come in and install another Saddam, and if you keep the Ba'ath Party largely intact, they're frightened you're going to do that. And then if you do that, you probably get an earlier Shia insurgency. Or you do what they did, which is you do de-Ba'athify and you get a Sunni uprising. In other words, there's no obvious technical administrative solution here. What you've got is politics, and it's the politics of a country of people who have learnt quite rationally to be frightened of each other under Saddam Hussein's rule, but without that Leviathan being there. And so I think actually the problem began as soon as they crossed the Rubicon, that they were walking into this nightmare. They were walking into a tragedy. With the most, if you'd had a steering committee of Paddy Ashtown, Rory Stewart, and I can't think of a third person who's very wise, they would have struggled almost just as much with the problem.
Alan.
Thank you for your view. I take your point that in 2001 America was formidably the most frightening military power in the world. But before 2001 already, there were factors in track that America itself was becoming a very unstable entity. Since then, and let's remember that in Korea and Vietnam, America was defeated despite its formidable military capacity. And those defeats have continued on. Amidst that one amazing quagmire of reasons that you so well outlined for us going into Iraq, could it be that Paul Kennedy's predictions about the rising forward of great powers applies here, that America is a great power, very rapidly going to decline?
So it's a great point. So I think I would want to draw a slightly sharper distinction between Washington's consciousness over the 90s into 2001 and Washington's consciousness in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, because the US during the Cold War was obviously throwing its weight around, but there was much less sense of it's the unipole that can achieve almost miraculous feats with arms. They were more scared. That didn't mean they were less violent, but there was not the same kind of sunny utopian view of what they were doing. What happens is the loss of strategic discipline, because there's no longer a near-peer adversary, and the ones that do have nuclear arsenals, particularly Russia, are effectively prostrate for a while. And they look out on a unipolar world, and they mistake a unipolar world for a world where there's no resistance. And they walk into Iraq, and boy do they get hostile resistance and balancing. To take your point further, yes, I do think Paul Kennedy was onto something in the sense of self-inflicted wounds. He was talking as well about things like defence budgets and economic models and overconsumption and more sort of structural things, and I think those were big problems. Those problems would have still been problems, but the war on terror added to their weight.
Thanks very much, Patrick, for sharing with us this evening. I think whenever we speak about things like what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, we're still very conscious that we live in this very uncertain world today. As we look at our own region, the Ukraine, we have some students here who are from Iran, from Myanmar. There are things going on all around the world at the moment that I know worry many of our current generation. And it's good that you're able to come and actually throw some insight into what has happened in terms of the causes of some wars. And I know that we've got others in our audience this evening. I think of Professor Blaney, one of our fellows, who has written a great book on the causes of wars. And I think also of Richard, who is the president of AIIA, who's thinking of how we end wars. And that would be an interesting subject, I think, for another day. But Patrick, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm glad that we've been able to offer you the trifecta of Ormond, Trinity, and now Queen's.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.